Okay. So first, I'd like to talk about standard and non-standard data in fraud investigations and forensic accounting engagements. So first, what is the difference between standard and non-standard data in forensic accounting engagements and fraud investigations in the way that we use it as part of this data sleuth process?
Right. So, first of all, when you're talking about standard versus non-standard data, you're talking specifically about quantitative data, or both of those terms you're using to describe sources of quantitative data, which I just want to throw out there because I think in the book you also talk about some qualitative data that we use. People who are familiar with kind of the broader world of data analysis might be thinking that we're talking about structured versus unstructured data, which is, kind of sounds like some parallel terms, but is a little bit different than what we're talking about. So just to kind of like get people on the same page here, when we're talking about standard and non-standard data, both are quantitative data sources that we're going to use in our data analysis. But the standard data sets that we use are generally the same. Data is contained in that data source each time, each case, each, instance or example of that type of data. Another way to think about it is that it's probably going to have the same fields in the data set. And then it's also typically those data sources are going to be, I was trying to think of the best way to put this, but objectively or automatically prepared, like bank statements, credit card statements, payroll reports. The values that are in those data sources are just kind of like created as part of an automatic process, if that makes sense. Like in that way, they're very reliable. Whereas non-standard data sources, not only could the fields included be a lot more variable depending on the case or the data source, but sometimes the preparation or the data entry might be subjective, or it might be more prone to human error, data entry error, that kind of thing. Non-standard data sources might consist of paper records that we have to scan and digitize. So things like accounting records, we use the GL detail a lot, specifically invoices, exports from a purchasing system like POs, timesheets, exports from a point of sale system, inventory records, employee and HR records, paper receipts. We were just talking recently about a case with paper receipts. Paper calendar entries. I didn't work on that one, but I can think of a case where we used that. Audit or user logs, which we talk a lot about the audit trail in QuickBooks, but all kinds of, point of sale systems and other things too would have similar user logs. Obviously, that category just includes a ton of different things, and they're very diverse depending on the case, but it's pretty much anything outside of like our really common standard data sources that are the bank statements, credit card statements, payroll reports are really the big three.
Yeah, the other day I was in a meeting with a nonprofit that I'm on the board, and they were talking about a new program, and they wanted to have the people who were implementing the program like keep a log of how many people they served, right? Which is such a great idea. But as I'm sitting there, I was like, can I weigh in on how I think that should be done? Because they were just talking about like writing it on a piece of paper and scanning it in. And I was like, you realize that everything these service providers write down, someone has to digitize them to actually create any value at all. So I was like, could we do maybe a Google form or something that would at least put it into an Excel spreadsheet, but still not be completely like difficult or whatever on the person filling it out. So anyway, I just was like thinking immediately because we'd been talking about this and I was prepping for this podcast and I was like, more non-standard data sources. Like, but even more so like that it's on paper. Like we can't analyze anything that's on paper without somehow digitizing it to get like a complete understanding of what we're working with. So that kind of leads to the next question, like how does a financial investigator harness the information and first in standard data sources? So how do we take standard data sources like you mentioned, bank statements, credit card statements, or payroll reports are the three that I talk about in the book that are you can generally expect this type of information. And I like what you said about it being objective information. It's not subjective, like 1 month the bank's going to put some checks on there and some checks aren't. Like it's just an automatic process and a reporting of that automatic process. So I like that a lot. But how do we, as financial investigators, actually make standard data sources usable in a financial investigation?
So this is, first of all, something that I was thinking about in preparing for this podcast is that, man, a lot of people think that this data processing and cleaning step is like the boring required part before you get to the good fun stuff. That's like the data analysis. But seriously, I get so much satisfaction from kind of working through these processes and optimizing our data processing and cleaning. And um, it's just, there's so much more to this than I think people think, and it's really not boring. So that said, and the other thing too is that I think this is what you and I were just mentioning the other day. When we start talking to people about how we handle this part of the process, this is one of the biggest things that people are like, okay, wait, just a minute. What did you say you used? Let me write that down. Like, I feel like this is a pain point for so many people that anything that we've learned along the way, people are always like really excited to hear about. So, if processing of standard data sources is needed to get it from, hopefully they're not in, paper. Most of the time, our standard data sources, we can at minimum get a PDF. But if there's that extra step of processing that's needed to get them in kind of a tabular format, like a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet, often we can automate that because the data that's contained in these sources is so standard from case to case and from, bank to bank or whatever. So we use something called Money Thumb to process our bank and credit card statements. That's a really good tool for taking those standard types of PDFs and turning them into a spreadsheet. For things that are a little bit different from just a standard bank or credit card statement, but still kind of within that standard category. And you may be familiar with it if you are familiar with the audit side of things. I know a lot of auditors also use IDEA for data analysis, but IDEA has some data import tools and they have a PDF import tool. So that's something that we'll use for really commonly payroll reports if we get those in a PDF format. And then kind of a third way that sounds almost like too simple to be true, but a lot of times Donna has found that we can just copy and paste from PDFs if they're OCR'd. And sometimes that works better than the IDEA import. It just kind of depends on the layout of the PDF. I guess the other thing that I want to talk about in terms of harnessing standard data sources, and this is another little point that seems like too easy to be true, but it's really helped us, is with payroll reports. If you can just like send the payroll provider a screenshot of like a mock-up of what you're talking about, I just find that there's often this communication barrier where we'll be asking for a certain kind of report, like, okay, we need this information. And they just kept like, and this happened to us a lot before we kind of figured out this trick. They would just keep sending us these PDFs that were just not, like, people didn't understand that a PDF was not very usable from a computer readable standpoint or a data analytics standpoint. So like if you just kind of draft up a little Excel spreadsheet with some columns that are like what you're looking for and send them a picture of that, then I feel like people are like, oh, that's what you're looking for. Yeah, we can pull something like that. And then they get you what you need and it's already in a tabular format and you just don't even have to mess with the PDFs at all. So that's kind of our little trick for getting the data you need. But sometimes that's still not possible. And in that case, it's nice to have those tools that can convert PDFs. I guess the last note too, and seriously cut me off at any point, Leah, because I know I'm rambling, but we sometimes, even though these data sources are, standard and we like them because they're really easy to use, there are components that just can't be automated. Check payees are kind of the big one that we deal with regularly. Even if they're, typewritten, but a lot of our check images and the types of cases that we work are going to have handwritten checks. So scheduling those manually from check images, and similarly, deposit items are kind of the same thing. We don't look at those for every case, but if we do need deposit items, those are going to have to be manually entered. But that kind of manual data processing is still fairly efficient for us compared to other kinds of manual data entry, just because we've done it so many times. I think we've really optimized our processes around that. And again, like big thanks to Donna because she's done a lot of work on that.
Yes. Just a couple of things that you mentioned I wanted to comment on. First, about kind of this data processing step being the boring step. I know I've shared on the podcast before that when I worked for the FBI, I entered data like by hand. There was no Money Thumb or ScanWriter or Bank Scan or IDEA or any of these tools back then. So I was the one who hand entered all this information. And I did find it really boring. I was telling some or Arts University students last week. Like, it was boring. For the first couple of weeks, I thought, how am I ever going to do this for 2 years? Because that's how long I could work for them. I thought, how in the world am I ever going to do this because without falling asleep every day because it's so boring? But what I started doing was realizing that actually I had the best information first. And so if I understood the case and if I understood where the case was going, what the allegations were, then I could actually identify some of those items before anyone else saw the data. And that created a lot of opportunities. And I won't like spoil it, but I do talk about that in the book. Um, and just that experience. And what I found being that first person to look at that data